Masechet Baba Kama Daf Tet Vav. The Mishnah listed a whole bunch of requirements necessary in order to pay damages. And one of them was Al Pi Adim. Has to be that there are witnesses that said, listen, we saw you damaged that person's item, and therefore you have to pay. So what is this coming to teach us? Perat modeh biknas ve'achar kach ba'u edim shehu patur. This is coming to exclude someone who admits to paying a fine, and then witnesses come. This is a general rule regarding a fine as opposed to compensation. You see, if I owe someone $100 because I borrowed it from them, and I have to pay them no matter what, even if there are no witnesses, I have to come forward and pay it to him because I owe it to him. This is different from a fine. For example, if a cop catches me speeding, he's going to give me a ticket, I have to pay a fine. If I go to a cop and say, listen, last week I drove above the speed limit, he's not going to give me a fine for that because I'm coming and admitting it, which shows that I learned my lesson. A fine is not compensation for a loss, but rather something that's there to prevent me from taking a certain action. And that's the logic behind the idea that if you admit to something that for which you would have to pay a fine, then you don't have to pay it. So what about in this case where he admitted to it, and then after I admitted that, listen, I caused you this damage, so you know what? I admit it, and so therefore I don't have to pay the fine. We're assuming here that payment for damages is a fine. We're going to discuss this soon. And then witnesses came afterwards. So even though the witnesses did come afterwards, and if I hadn't admitted, then I would have had to pay because there are witnesses. So this part of the Mishnah teaches us that even if witnesses came, if I admitted before the witnesses came, then I do not have to pay. Good. That's all good, according there's a machloket about this. So this is a good answer according to the opinion that says, if I admit to a fine and then witnesses come, then I am not liable. But there's another opinion that says, even if I admit to the fine, but then witnesses come after, I am liable. This is like, if a speed camera caught me speeding and I didn't get anything in the mail, so I think I got away with it. I go and I call up and I say, listen, I know I was speeding, I want to pay. So they say, okay, you don't have to pay. But it turns out that the camera did catch me, and then I get a ticket after. I can't say, oh, but I called you and admitted it, therefore I don't have to pay. No, it doesn't help. Since there were, in fact, witnesses, even though they didn't come yet, the fact that they eventually would have come means I would have had to pay no matter what. And admitting beforehand doesn't help. Admission for a fine would only help if there are no witnesses at all. If they didn't come and don't come afterwards, then okay, I don't have to pay because of a fine. But if witnesses come at any point, even after I admitted, I have to pay. According to that, then what's the explanation of this Mishnah? And the answer is Sefa istericha le. We actually need these words, al pi edim, are just part of the next phrase, bnei chorin u bnei berit, that the witnesses have to be free and Jewish. Bnei chorin muta avadim, bnei berit muta goyim. Free is to exclude if they're slaves, and Jewish to exclude non-Jews who would not be valid witnesses. Usericha, I need both of them. I couldn't learn one from a kal vachomer from the other. If it only said regarding slaves, so I would say, oh, you know why slaves can't be a good witness? Because they don't have a lineage. The lineage of a slave is not legally recognized. Obviously, everyone has a father and a mother, but one of the degradations of slavery, besides work and all that, and not having freedom of one's time, that the family structure and within slavery is not recognized. So maybe you'd say he can't be a witness because he doesn't have lineage, but non-Jews actually do have recognized lineage. So maybe I would have thought maybe a non-Jew can be a witness. And so that's why it has to tell me that a non-Jew cannot be a witness. If you only tell me regarding Goy, I would say the reason he can't be a witness is because he's not liable to commandments. But an Eved is Eved Kanani we're talking about. who is liable to commandments to the same degree as women are. Misvot or misvot lo taseh and misvot aseh shelo hazman gerama, the Eved has to do, and therefore I might have thought that a non-Jew can't be a witness because he doesn't do any mitzvot. Eved does do mitzvot, so maybe he can be a witness. That's why you have to teach me both of them. The next item in the Mishnah says, "V'hanashim bichlal hanezek min hanemileh." Women are included in all the laws of damages. What's the source of this? We're going to see sources both for women being liable if they are a damager, and also women are being eligible to receive payment if they are the victims of damage. So we're going to see three sources. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, V'chen katana deber b'Ishmael. Amar Keda, ish or isha ki yasu mikol hatot. This is talking about an asham gezelot. If I lie about a monetary item and swear falsely about it, then I have to bring an asham. And it says here, ish or isha, a man or a woman. Hishva katub isha leish lechol onashin shebat Torah. And since it says it here in this example, we explicate it to other examples, all other examples of damages, all punishments. Men and women are equal. Just like a woman would have to bring such an asham, and this is a type of punishment, so we extrapolate from here all other punishments. So there, and one of the punishments is payment for damage. So this is source number one. Deber bi el azad tana vel mishpatim asher tasim lefnehem ishva katub ish leisha lechol dinin shebat Torah. This is the beginning of Parashat Mishpatim, where we learn lots of these laws about damages and monetary things. It says to place before them. These are the laws to place before them. So before them, it means everyone who's there, right? Everyone that's standing, they're still at Har Sinai. And so the pasuk is equating men and women to all civil laws in the Torah, everything that's including damages that are mentioned in Mishpatim. That's source number two. See, the first one's a bit more general because it is about Asham, but we're explicating all onashin. Here, it seems specific to dinin, meaning civil laws. Third source, Amar Keda, vehemit ish or isha. If my ox goes and kills a man or a woman, even though my ox did it, I am liable to capital punishment. Even though technically I'm liable, I can pay kofer, I can pay a ransom amount, and that way I don't have to get capital punishment. So that's the general rule. And you see, it goes out of its way. Hishva katub ish isha leish lechol mitot shebat Torah. It doesn't matter whether my ox kills a man or a woman. If she is the victim, she gets paid that ransom amount. So here, the first two sources were about a man and woman are equal in their punishment or payment. It means they have to pay. And this source is saying that if she is the victim, it makes no difference, at least regarding if an ox kills a man or a woman, the ox owner is liable to pay the kofed equally. So here she is the victim. Good. Now, either way, we're going to learn that, if she has to pay, she will also be eligible to get paid. If she gets paid as a victim, she also will have a responsibility to pay. Kind of the Gemara is assuming that the reciprocal responsibility and liability go together. Why do I need all these three sources, even though the different sages have said each one? In fact, just one of them would not be sufficient. If we only had the first one regarding an asham effectuates atonement between a person and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So I would say there, Hashem had pity on a woman so that they can have atonement. A woman causes damage or in that case, lies about something, and then swears falsely and wants to achieve atonement. So being able to bring an asham is a mercy. Thank you. Now I can get atonement for it. Aval dinin ish devar masa matan in isha la. But regarding actually paying in civil laws, I would say it's usually the way of men to go engage in business. They're the ones that are going out and being merchants and going to the marketplace and doing things. So therefore they are responsible in all those matters. Whereas women, it's not usually their way. to be engaged in business. So I might have thought that women are not liable in such matters. So that's why I need the second pasuk. Now, if I had only the second pasuk about all Parashat Mishpatim, I would say, I would say, look, women have to be obligated and responsible and also be eligible to receive payment in these matters because she needs it to sustain herself. Not every woman has a husband or a father or some man in her life that's going to go do business. Sometimes women have to go and do business themselves. So they need it just to live. So if you exclude women from all the laws of damages or civil laws, then no one's going to want to do business with her, because that means, if she doesn't pay back a loan, I can't take her. If she causes damage, if I give her something to watch and she doesn't do a good job, I can't make her pay. So then no one's ever going to want to engage in business, and then they won't be able to live. And so I might say that yes, women have to be involved in that. Just to live. Aval kapara ish de bar mitzvah hi isha de la bat mitzvah la. But regarding bringing an asham to get atonement, maybe only a man, since he's commanded regarding these matters, he needs atonement. But maybe a woman maybe doesn't need atonement because she's not commanded. We'll just we'll make her pay and let her get paid because of living, but maybe she's not really commanded, so she doesn't need atonement. So that's why I need the first pasuk to teach me that's not true. She does need atonement. Now, that's why I need the first two. But even if I had the first two, hacha mishum kapara, hacha mishum chiyuta, aval inyan ketala, ishta, bar mitzvah l'shalem kofer, isha la. I might think that I need the first two because it has to teach me that, yes, a woman is eligible, we want her to get atonement. And she has to be involved in the laws of civil matters, because that's a matter of to be able to sustain herself. But regarding being killed, I might have thought, this is a crazy havamina, but don't worry, we'll reject it right away, that a man who is obligated in commandments, that the owner of the ox, if he kills a man, is liable because he killed someone who is obligated in commandments. But women who are not commanded in all commandments, they're obviously commanded in actually most of them, but since she's not commanded in all mitzvot, I might have thought that my ox kills a woman, I'm not liable. So that's what I might have thought. Anyway, that's not true. And one is liable to capital punishment, although he can pay his way out and give a kofed and pay ransom if his ox kills a man or a woman. And so that's why I need the third pasuk. If I had only the third pasuk, mishum deika ibud neshama, aval hani tarte deleka ibud neshama emala sericha. I might have thought only in the third one, third case where someone dies, I might say, listen, when it comes to loss of life, there men and women are going to be equal. But the other ones where it's not loss of life, it's just some damage or stealing or some payment that's owed. So there, I might think that's not so serious, and maybe women are not included in those commandments, and that's why I need the first two. And so this explains why I need all three pesukim. The Mishnah mentioned hanizak v'hamazik betashlumin. Both the injured party and the one that does the damages share in the responsibility for payment for the damages. So it seems to be referring to a shor tam, where the owner of the shor tam that did the damages pays half, and the victim also basically he'll have to pay for half the damages himself. He doesn't get paid for it. Okay, so we're going to see this was going to come up as a proof or a challenge in within the following machloket. Itmar. Palganizka Rapapa Amar Mamona, Ravuna Bered Rav Yoshua Amar Kenasa, a very fundamental machloket about the nature of the chatzi nezek, the half payment that is given by the owner of a shor tam. According to Rav Papa, that half payment for damages is compensation. It's a regular compensatory amount because you were damaged. According to that, you'd have to explain why it should only be half, right? I mean, if I stole $100 from you, I have to pay back all of it, not just half of it. Why in damages for a shor tam would it be only half? But anyway, it is compensation. According to Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, he says it's a fine. Now, if it's a fine, why should there be a fine at all? We have to explain that. And in other words, I don't owe anything really in terms of compensation, which we have to ask, well, why don't you owe anything? And if you don't owe anything, what's the reason for the fine? So now we're going to explain each opinion. Rav Papa Amar Mamona, Kasavar Stam Shevarim La Becheskat Shimur Kaiman, Ubedinu Deba'e Leshalume Kuleh. Rav Papa says that the half payment is in fact compensation. And here it's based on the assumption that generally oxen, just regular oxen, shoratam, are not presumed that they are safeguarded. In other words, their nature is not going to prevent them from acting violently. In other words, we have to assume, even a shoratam, we have to assume it's going to get out of hand, it's going to act violently. So therefore, the letter of the law, really, bedinhu, that I, the owner of the shoratam, should have to pay 100%. That's really what it should be. However, the Torah says we want to have pity on the person because he wasn't warned yet. And even though really, everybody should be careful with their oxen, even if it never gored before, because they have a tendency to be violent, and therefore you should be careful, and you should be responsible for 100%. Nevertheless, because you didn't have a warning yet, once, twice, three times, and so then you're not going to be as vigilant in it, and then you're going to have to keep paying this amount, the full amount. So you know what Torah says? We're going to have mercy on the owner of the shoratam to only pay half. Okay, so it's a special dispensation because until the person is warned multiple times, and if you're already warned multiple times and you still didn't, then the letter of the law kicks in. That's Rav Papa, so it is compensation. Rav Huna ber Rav Yehoshua amar kenasa kasabar setam shevarim cheskat shimur kaimeh. Rav Huna starts off with the basic assumption that oxen generally are safe, are presumed to be safe. A normal ox is going to be safe. And so remember, the difference between a bull and an ox. They're the same exact animal, except the bull has all of its anatomy, and therefore is a lot of testosterone, is very wild. Ox means that it's castrated, and therefore it doesn't have testosterone and is calmed down. So, bulls would be useful for something, but generally to work in the fields, you would have oxen. And so oxen generally are tame. And therefore, they are presumed to be safe. And therefore, if my ox happens to be strangely goes and gores someone, really, I should not have to pay. Bedinu delal l'shalem kelal, I don't pay anything. But the Torah says, you know what? Even though from the morality of the law, I can't even say letter of the law because this is in the Torah, but from basic natural morality, you shouldn't have to pay anything because generally they're safe. Nevertheless, the Torah comes and gives a fine so that you'll be extra careful and safeguard your ox, even if it's not didn't have any history, because sometimes they get out of hand. And therefore, it's going to be a fine. Once it's a fine, we can understand why it's not a full amount. It's a fine just to make you a little bit more aware. And that's why it's only 50%. Okay, so that's the machloket. Now we're going to see 4 attempted proofs, 4 one or the other, and the last one actually will be conclusive, but the first 3 won't be. The first proof is from our very Mishnah, Tenan. Hanizak v'mazik betashlumin says that both the nizak and the mazik share in tashlumin. If you say that the half payment is compensation, then that makes sense that you're saying the nizak shares in the compensation. The mazik pays half the compensation, and the nizak will have to come up from his own pocket with the other half to make up the damages. But according to the one who says that the mazik himself is only paying a fine, so that money that the nizak gets is actually not really his by right. You have to pay a fine. So now, where's the money going to go? Just put it in the temple treasury, or is it going to go? Okay, we'll give it to the nizak. But really, the nizak is not really owed anything in terms of compensation. So it's, even what the mazik paid is not compensation to the nizak. So there's certainly the nizak's loss you're not going to call compensation. There is no compensation anywhere. So there's a challenge to the opinion that says that it is a knas. And so the answer is La nisrecha ela difchat nebela. You're right. We're not talking about the half payment that one gives and the other and the nizak has to take as a loss. Rather, we're talking about the diminishing value of the carcass. There, as we saw before, the nizak is responsible for that diminishing value. The mazik would be in his interest to assess the value of the carcass right at the time of the accident, and he can deduct that from his payment. I don't have to pay that amount. And so therefore, the nizak really should sell it right away before it decays. If he doesn't and it decays, then the nizak is going to lose out, and that is called compensation. So that's the contribution that the nizak is giving in terms of the compensation. Now we ask, hold on. I mean, this is acceptable, except that the Mishnah already talked about this. When the Mishnah says tashlumei nezik, payment of damage, and we learned from that the owner of the victim ox has to deal with his own animal, which means he has to go and take it, and it's his responsibility, his loss, if it of any deterioration that happens to it. So we already know that. Why would you have to say it twice in this Mishnah? And the answer is you do have to say it twice. Hatam betam, chada betam, v'chada b'mu'ad. We needed to know it once for the law of shor tam, that the nizak absorbs the loss, and that shor mu'ad also, that the nizak absorbs the loss. It wouldn't be obvious from one to the other. Usricha. So you need both. Why? If you told me that shor tam, the nizak absorbs the loss, maybe there the mazik is, we were lenient on the mazik because he wasn't forewarned. But if it's a shor mu'ad, I might say that the mazik, you should have known, you have to pay everything, and you're responsible. The mazik is responsible for the loss, the deterioration. So that's why you have to tell me that's true from mu'ad. Mu'ad. If it only told me mu'ad, mishum dekam mishalim kuleh, aval tam emala sericha. Well, I would say mu'ad. Maybe you know what mu'ad, for the owner for a shor mu'ad, he doesn't have to pay for the diminishing of the value of the carcass, because after all, he's paying a full amount. So we give him off a little bit. You're paying 100%, minus the value of the carcass. So since you're paying so much, we'll give you a break, and you don't have to pay for the diminishing value. But for shor tam, where he's only paying half to begin with, maybe the owner of the shor tam is more responsible. So that's why he has to say shor tam also. So now we know in both cases, the nizak is the one that absorbs the loss, and so that's why we need it twice. But in any case, we did answer the question. The tashlumin does not refer to the other half of the chasi nezik, since the chasi nezik is only a fine to begin with. The person who says that this is a fine, Rav Huna would say that the contribution of the nizak is actually regarding the diminishing value of the carcass. Okay, second attempted proof, Tashema. Ma ben tam lemuad. A Mishnah on tomorrow's daf says, what's the difference between the laws of shor tam and shor mu'ad? Shatam mishalem chasi nezek migufo, mu'ad mishalem nezek shalem min ha'aliyah. Shor tam, it's not only that he only pays half. The owner of the shor tam has a max limit that he has to pay, which is the value of the body, the value of the goring ox. If the goring ox is worth only 100 and it gores $1,000 ox and causes, let's say, full damage, kills it. So really, half of 1,000 should have to pay 500, but there's a max. Since my ox that gored you is only worth 100, that's the max that I have to pay. Okay, it maxes out at 500. It maxes out at the value of the goring ox. Whereas for mu'ad, I have to pay the full amount and I have to pay it from my best land. In other words, I have to go out of pocket. It's not limited by the value of the ox, of any ox. I have to pay the full amount and from the best quality land So that's a fundamental difference between them. Okay, ve'im ita litne name ha. Tam eno meshalem al pi atzmo, mu'ad meshalem al pi atzmo. Now, if you say that the payment for a short tam is a fine, see, for shor mu'ad it's compensation, because there you're paying the full amount. So everybody agrees with that. The machloket is only with short tam. If, according to that, as Rav Huna says, the payment of a short tam is only a fine, then there should be an additional distinction between them, and Mishnah doesn't say it. We should also add another distinction for a short tam. Since it's a fine, if I come and admit it, let's say nobody was there, there's no witnesses to see that saw what happened, but I was there. I saw my short do damage to your short, my short tam. So if I come and admit it, I say, listen, I was there, I want to admit this to you, I should be not liable to pay, because in a fine you're not liable to pay. Whereas if my shor was a shor mu'ad, and again there's no witnesses, and I come and admit it, I would still have to pay. Just like if I steal something, if I admit it, I have to pay the compensation amount, right? The basic amount of what I stole. I don't have to pay the double, because the double is a fine. So that's the general rule. So if you said that shor tam is the payment of shor tam is a fine, then you should have an additional distinction that for shor tam admission I don't have to pay. For shor mu'ad admission I would have to pay. Why doesn't the Mishnah add that? If it's asking ma ben shor tam or ma ben tam mu'ad, it should say this too. Therefore, this is a proof that tam is actually compensation, and that's why the law is actually the same in both. That even when I admit, I have to pay for both. And the answer that Rav Huna can give is Tana v'shiyer. You're right. This is a true distinction, and this list in the Mishnah is not comprehensive. It only gave one distinction, even though this other distinction Rav Huna says I think would be true. Okay, fine. You can say that it's not comprehensive, but then you have to show that it's leaving out at least two things. Mai shiyer de hai shiyer. What else is it leaving out? In the list, you don't just leave out one thing. And says shiyer hasi kofer. If my animal kills a person, I'm technically liable to a death penalty, but I can pay ransom. Now, that's only true for shor tam. For shor mu'ad, then I have to pay a ransom. But for shor tam, I don't pay anything, not even chasi kofer. So when it says leaving out chasi kofer, it means yet another distinction that for shor tam, there's a difference between damage, where I have to pay half, and a ransom, where I don't pay anything at all. So that's a second thing that it left out. So yeah, it left out this thing about admission, and it also left out that for when it comes to paying ransom, short time you don't pay any ransom, and so that therefore, see, it is leaving things out. So this is a good defense for Rav Huna, but we reject it. Imishum hatzi kofer lav shiurahu hamaneh Rabbi Yosef Galilihi tamar tam mishalem hatzi kofer. This is not necessarily would this be something that is left out, because it could be. We're not saying for sure that the author of this Mishnah is Rabbi Yosef Galili, but it could be Rabbi Yosef Galili. And if so, if you want to bring a proof, it has to be a proof, absolute proof, no matter what. And here, if we say that this is following Rabbi Yosef Galili, it happens to be that he says that a shor tam that kills someone, I have to pay half of the ransom amount. Shor mu'ad would be the full ransom amount. But that's follows in line with the same laws of damages, right, which we already know. And so this is not something that is leaving out. And therefore, this would be a problem, because now it's only leaving out one thing. So, in fact, if we follow Rabbi Yosef Galili, then we would have a serious challenge against Rav Huna, who says it's a fine. But we don't have to follow Rabbi Yosef Galili. We're just saying if you do follow them. But Rav Huna could easily say that we're following Rabbanan, and according to Rabbanan, Chatzi Kofed is a difference between them, that you pay full amount for a shor mu'ad, but you pay nothing, no Kofed for a shor tam, and left that out. And so left out also this case of admission, and so left two things out, and therefore there is no challenge from this source. And so now we move on to the third attempted proof. Tashema hemit shori et peloni. This is a Mishnah in Masechet Ketubot. If someone comes and makes an admission and said, listen, my ox killed that person, or shoro shel peloni, or someone comes to the Beit Din and says, listen, nobody was there, nobody knows, but I want to admit my ox killed that person's ox. Either it killed that person or it killed that person's ox. One has to pay. So you see that there one pays for a case of admission. My love betam. Are we not talking about all cases, including a shor tam? And if a shor tam is compensation, well, then that makes perfect sense that you have to still pay. But if chatzi nezek that a shor tam pays is a fine, then one should not have to pay for an admission. So this is a challenge to Rav Huna, who says that it's a fine. We answer, La b'mo'ad. This Mishnah, no, could be talking about only a shor mo'ad. Shor mo'ad, everyone agrees, is compensation. So there's no problem from here. So we ask, Aval tam mai, hachiname den mishalem al pi asmo. So now you're telling me, but if it's a shor tam, and I admit, then I won't have to pay anything? Ihachi adetane sefa, hemit shori et abdi shel peloni, en mishalem al pi asmo, liflog v'litne b'dideh. If so, look at the continuation of that Mishnah. The Mishnah wants to make a contrast between cases where one does not pay based on admission and when one does. Here is one does, because so it's assuming that the first half is compensation, but the second half of the Mishnah says, if my ox killed a slave, then there's a special law regarding slave that if my ox kills a slave, I pay 30 shekel, no matter what, no matter how much the slave is worth, whether it's worth less or more. And that shows when you have a fixed amount that's not actually anchored in how much the damage is, that's a sign that it's a fine. And in fact, if I come and admit that my ox killed your slave, I do not pay based on my admission. And so you see that, okay, fine, the Mishnah makes sense, but if it were true that for a short time, that the first half is talking about shor mo'ad, and a payment of a short time was a fine, then why are you jumping to a case of killing a slave in order to show this distinction? Liflog v'nitneh b'dideh, why not show the distinction within the very cases of regular damage to an ox or to killing a person? Let's focus on not the killing of a person, but the damage of an ox. And the Mishnah could have said as follows: if I admit to my ox killing a person or damage to or killing your ox, let's talk about killing an ox. Or damage to the ox, then I admit to it, I have to pay, because that's shor mu'ad, right? This is how Rav Huna is going to explain it. Fine, but then if you want to make a distinction, that's shor mu'ad, which is compensation, and then you should want to make a distinction and show a case of a fine. You should have said that's only because it's mu'ad. But if it's tam, then I don't pay, because for shor tam, it's only a fine. So you see that it should have said that. The fact that it jumps all the way to a case of killing a slave in order to find the case of a fine, that means that shor tam would not be such a case. Shor tam would be compensation. So that's a challenge to Rav Huna. We answer, Kula b'mu'ad kamaide. No, it's not jumping at all. We're all talking about mu'ad. The Mishnah wants to concentrate the b'resha and the sefa of a shor mu'ad. So within shor mu'ad, where can we find compensation and fine? Well, compensation, you can find the regular case of it killing a person or animal, and the fine you can find regarding Ibid. And so it's not jumping to a different topic. It's true, it's jumping from killing a person, an animal, to a slave, but it's all within mu'ad. So the Mishnah reads perfectly well, assuming that the Resha is talking about shor mu'ad, and the sefa also is mu'ad, and so there's no proof here regarding shor tam. The Mishnah may not be talking about shor tam at all. So Rav Huna is able to live another day. And then we get to the fourth and final proof, Tashema. Zeh kilal, kol hameshalem yoter al ma shehizik eno meshalem al pi asmo. The Mishnah, that Mishnah that we just cited continues and says, this is the general rule. Any case where one pays more than the value of the damages, that shows that it's a fine, because if you're paying compensation, it should be equal to the amount of the damages. But in any case where it's more, like in the case of a slave there, it could be the slave is only worth 10 shekel, but if my ox kills a slave, I still have to pay 30 shekel. Any case like that, if I admit to it, I don't have to pay because it's a fine. That's what the Mishnah said. My love, ha pachot mima shezik meshalem. Wait, we can infer from the wording of this Mishnah that if my payment is less than the damage amount, then I would have to pay. And chatzi nezek is, by definition, less than the compensation amount. And so I would have to pay based on admission. And that's a proof that it's compensation, not a fine. Isn't that a good proof? Said la hakema shehizik meshalem. No, when the Mishnah says that if I don't, anytime it's more, it wasn't saying more as opposed to less. It was just saying as long as it's not exactly the same as the amount of the damage, more or less. It happened to say more, but it really means any amount that's different from the amount of the damage is considered a fine. And so chasi nezek also is considered a fine. And if I admit, I wouldn't have to pay. That's how Rav Huna can answer. But we challenge that. Aval pachot mai, hachinam d'lo meshalem. You're telling me if it's less than the amount of the damage, then I would not have to pay when I admit because it's a fine. Is that how you're reading it? Ihachi. If so, the Mishnah could have said that clearly. Instead of saying anytime that the payment is more than the amount of the damage, it's called a fine and you don't have to pay. Don't say that in the Mishnah. The Mishnah should have said precisely what it means. Anytime the payment is not exactly the same as the amount of the damage, then it's called a fine, and I don't have to pay when I admit it. And then I would know either more or less. So the wording of the Mishnah sounds like only more, but not less, and therefore less is in fact compensation. Tiyubta, this is a refutation of Rav Huna. So we had a bunch of refutations, and he kept dodging the bullet. But now we finally got him, and we rejected the idea of the opinion of Rav Huna that chatzi nezek is a fine. And you'd think after all this work, we finally have a good conclusion. But then surprisingly, we say v'hilchata palga nizka kenasa. Actually, according to halacha, the bottom line halacha is that we do follow Rav Huna, and it's a kenas. Even though we were just rejected his opinion and proved him wrong, nevertheless halacha follows him. We wonder about this. Tiyubta v'hilchata, you refuted his opinion, and then you say, but the halacha follows that opinion? It says, in tama mai havya tiyubta mishum de la katani kemo shehizik. Yes. How did you refute him? Because you said that the Mishnah should have said if it's exactly the same as if the payment amount is exactly the same as the damage amount, then that's called compensation, right? And it doesn't say that. It says only more if the payment is more, like in the case of a slave. Like if it kill a slave that's worth less and I pay more, then you know it's a fine. But if my payment is less than the amount of the damage, then that's not a fine, that's called compensation. That was your proof, right? But you know what? That's not such a great proof. La pesika le kevan deika hasi nezek serorot tehilcheta gemira la demamonahu mishum hachi lo katane. Really, the author of that Mishnah in Ketubot did not want to make an absolute statement that any time the payment amount is not exactly equal to the compensation amount, that then it's a fine. He didn't want to say that because there is at least one example where this would not be true, where the compensation amount is in fact less, and yet it is compensation. The compensation amount is less than the damage, and yet it's not a fine. It's definitely compensation, and that's the case that we talked about all the way in the beginning of the Masechet of Chasi Nezek Serorot. If an ox is walking along and it kicks pebbles, and the pebbles go and cause damage, in that case, the owner of the ox has to pay half. And there's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that is mammon. That even though it's only half, but that is for definitely compensation. Since you have one exception, that's why the Mishnah went out of its way and said used the funny language and said only if it's more, then you know for sure that's called a fine and you wouldn't have to pay an admission. But the less it left out. It left it out because there is one case where it's definitely compensation in the case of pebbles. But in the other cases of paying less, like a normal chatzi nezek of a short tam that gores, that in fact could be a fine. And so Rav Huna actually could answer that last proof that you thought was a definite refutation is not a definite refutation. Since we can answer it, in the end we say halacha is that it is in fact a fine. Hai kalba da'achal imre v'shunara da'achal tannegola mishunehu v'la magbinan bebavel. Okay, now that we concluded that the payment of chasi nezik is a fine, so here's the thing about fines. Only a court in Eretz Yisrael can impose fines. You have to have a special level of semicha to do that. The courts in Bavel, even though there were great sages in Bavel, they were not authorized to impose fines. So therefore, anyone who had a fine problem in Bavel would have to go to Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so now that we know that halacha, well, if we have a case where a dog ate a lamb or a cat ate a chicken, and they don't have a history of this. This is a tam dog and a tam cat. This is not typical behavior. Since it's not typical behavior, it falls under the category of shod, of keren, of goring, even though it's actually eating something. But eating is defined, remember, eating is not defined as anything that it eats, where the Gemara is being very conceptual. Eating refers to damage that a animal does, and that is in its normal way of doing it. Which is eating. It goes in and it goes around and it eats food because that's what it does. It doesn't have intention to cause damage, and it's a normal way for it to do it. Then if it's within that category, it's called eating. But dogs eating a lamb or a cat eating a chicken is very unusual, not normal behavior. Goring is also not normal behavior. And so therefore, even though this is an act of eating, it falls under the category of goring. And we just said that for shor tam, or any tam animal that doesn't act within the category of goring, that is a fine. And therefore, when it happens in Bavel, we do not impose the fine. But that's only if the thing being eaten is big. A dog eating a big lamb or a cat eating a big chicken, that's really unusual. But if it's a small animal, that is this way. That they do eat small things, and so then that would be under the normal category of eating, and that would, depending on where it is, if it's like Birshut HaNizak, then you'd pay the full amount, and that's compensation, and then in Bavel you would have to pay. Now, back to the case of it eating in an unusual way, eating a big animal. V'tafas, if the victim goes and seizes property doesn't go to court, but just seizes property from the owner of that dog, lama pikinan min, we don't take it from him, because really he does deserve to collect that fine. So even though the court can't impose it in Bavel, if he takes it himself, then we leave it there. V'amar kib'u li zimna de'azilna lar'ad Yisrael kabinan le v'la'azel meshametinan le. And if the nizak says in Bavel, this happens to him, and he says, and the court says, sorry, this is a fine. This was a short time, chasi nezek, it's a fine, we can't do anything here. If the nizak says, I want an appointment in Eretz Yisrael, I want you to, make me an appointment, write me a letter to refer me there, to go to Eretz Yisrael, we do that for him because he has a right. And then, in such a case, if the mazik says, I don't want to go all the way to Eretz Yisrael, the court in Bavel can excommunicate him until he goes to the court. Usually, one litigant can't drag the other one to a faraway place. It's not fair. It says, well, I have to go all the way far away and pay for expenses to go all the way there. Usually you can't. But here, since there is no bet din that can adjudicate a fine in Bavel, so the nizak has a right to drag the mazik, and if the mazik doesn't go, he'll be excommunicated. And no matter what, the bet din in Bavel does have the right and a responsibility to excommunicate the owner of the animal, the perpetrating animal, until he removes the danger. If he has a wild dog that's going around and killing and eating sheep, then he has to get rid of that dog, right? He has to take care of it. And if he doesn't, then we can, even though we can't give him a fine, and remember the whole point of it being a fine is that really he doesn't owe money because it's an unusual thing. Most oxen and dogs and things are tam, and so we wouldn't expect it. So the fine is meant to prevent this from happening, and so the Bet Din in Bavel cannot impose a fine, but nevertheless they can excommunicate him until he gets rid of the danger. And how do you know that you can excommunicate people until they get rid of danger? Rabbi Natan Omer, minayin shelo yigadel adam keleb ra betoch beto, ve'al ya'amid sulam ra'ua betoch beto. Talmud lomar lo tasim damim bebetecha. Rabbi Natan, as a Braita says, that according to Rabbi Natan, how do you know that a person should not raise a vicious dog in his house that can likely to cause damage to other people? And you also shouldn't have a rickety ladder in your house that people will then climb it and fall, because the pasuk says that you shall not bring blood into your house. Don't set up things that someone can be that can cause someone to be injured, and if you knowingly could prevent it. So this is a good reason to have all kinds of building codes and things to make sure that the electricity and plumbing and structure of our homes and buildings are safe, because otherwise the owner of that home is responsible for putting people in danger. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.